Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to the Manhattan Project Saturday meetings that Lyndon LaRouche initiated a few years back. I'm Diane Sayre, and today is October 26, 2019. Now, I'm going to be joined today by Bill Jones remotely from our China desk, who also has what I think will be a very fascinating report on the International Aeronautical Congress, which he and his wife were involved in the last week, and then Jason Ross after that. But I'd like to situate things today because we're really in an amazing situation. And I was trying to put together a somewhat streamlined briefing, which would be brief, but it is a little bit difficult. So bear with me because I want people to sort of get the full force of where we are, which is truly a revolutionary situation. This year, 2019, is the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it is something that Lyndon LaRouche uniquely forecast and called for in an address which he gave in 1988, actually in the Kempinski Hotel in Berlin, Germany, where he said that the time was ripe for Germany to be reunified, and in return, because the Soviet Union was disintegrating economically, that the West would feed Poland. And at that moment, I remember I was a college student and watching him as a presidential candidate, and I thought, well, this is really interesting, but isn't this a little odd? I mean, there's no other presidential candidate standing over there in Germany calling for the Berlin Wall to come down, and who really thought it was going to come down? And then almost exactly a year, this was October 12th, Columbus Day, 1988, then almost exactly 1 year later, the Berlin Wall came down, and then what Mr. LaRouche had proposed, which is Berlin become the capital and so on, all occurred. But that great opportunity was missed, and because the forces that ran the witch hunt against Lyndon LaRouche, which are the same forces running the witch hunt against President Trump, prevailed in running the United States. Lyndon LaRouche was behind bars. The one individual who had been able to correctly forecast what was happening was not allowed to be on the American scene. And it's my opinion, and I think it's shared by others, that LaRouche was actually likely to be a major presidential candidate in 1988. He had played a significant role in the Reagan administration. We had candidates who were winning major Democratic primaries in Illinois in 1986, and LaRouche was a contender in the 1988 presidential election, so they made sure to call him every name in the book, frame him up, and keep him out of that potential leadership. Had we had that leadership, the world today would be a very, very different place. So I wanted to start by reading to you something that he said in his campaign platform, July 4th, 1989. He was in prison. He was put in prison in January of 1989. And he and his wife both warned that just because the communist system was bankrupt did not mean that the British free trade liberal system was going to succeed, but that this was going to collapse with an even greater force. And what he said is the following: a new revolutionary upsurge will become an increasingly dominant feature and compelling force during the 1989 through 1992 interval of crisis. It will sweep through Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas, reaching gale force inside our United States at some point during the coming 18 months. We are now rapidly approaching that point as growing public awareness of the catastrophic nature of the economic crisis intersects the fear that President Bush's escapades, this is not the direct quote from LaRouche, but his intent, in the Persian Gulf will lead to a new Vietnam War or worse. But this gale force, this is happening now. I think it was, at the time when he said it, I was, I don't know, but barely out of college, and thinking that this revolution would be coming imminently, and I think it was impossible to know how many tricks the British oligarchy would be able to play, how many new forms of loot and usury to maintain their system in some fraudulent form until the present day. But we are here now. We are at that moment. And I wanted to start with one of the positive aspects of this. When we were on the phone with Helga Zepp-LaRouche this morning, she talked about combined and uneven developments. You have certain things going on in the world which are absolutely phenomenal and very good. You have other things that are not so good. And clearly in the United States, we have quite a job to do in bringing the American population into a more profound understanding of what we're facing. So if you could put that, the first map with the countries in Africa. The other one. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. There has been a conference over the last October 24th and 25th in Sochi, Russia, attended by representatives of, I think, about 54 African nations, I think 44 heads of state. And there were very, very significant agreements, and I wanted the map of Africa with all the countries inside because unfortunately I think many Americans still have the mistaken view that Africa is a country and not a continent, and people don't consider how large it is and the fact that by 2050 this population will be over 2 billion and most of these people will be young. So you can see there on the map, I hope you recognize the outlines of some of these countries. The United States, including, I guess, Alaska with a little bit of overlap, can fit into the part of the northwest corner of the continent of Africa. The nation of India fits nicely into the Horn of Africa. China fits down there. This is a huge, huge area. Germany and France look like little countries on this map. So you think about what this means for the planet if this entire continent is transformed. Now we can go to the countries. So I'm going to read you just the beginnings of some of the agreements that were made there, and you can think about the implications. They're going to establish a Russia-Africa Partnership Forum, hold annual political consultations between ministers of foreign affairs of the Russian Federation and African states, continue greater cooperation in the field of security, first of all international terrorism and its forms and manifestations, as well as extremism, transnational crime, and trafficking in narcotic drugs, psychotropic substances, and their precursors. So major collaboration between Russia and the African states on fighting terrorism and drug running. Promote energy security cooperation, including the use of renewable energy sources, I would say emphatically including nuclear power, and I'll have more on that in a second. Work together to counter political dictatorship and financial blackmail in international trade and economic cooperation. And of course, Russia are somewhat experts on this, and the Russian economist Sergei Glaziev, who was someone very, very familiar with the work of Lyndon LaRouche, and whose book we published, the Schiller Institute published in English, actually said, don't allow the mistakes that Russia had with the International Monetary Fund, where we just got looted. And people may know, after the Berlin Wall came down, talk about a missed opportunity. What happened was Russia was turned into a giant black market with massive problems in prostitution, alcoholism, and their population was shrinking by 1 million people per year. It was a real genocide policy. And he said the nations of Africa have been suffering under this kind of thing for much longer than we did in Russia. But we suffered for decades under this, and we can't afford that mistake. Adhere to the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of state. This is exactly what Xi Jinping said also at a similar meeting in China, where 54 African heads of state attended. Consider the opportunities for scientific and technical cooperation in the field of peaceful uses of outer space. call for dedicated and comprehensive replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, whatever that is. Hopefully they mean to do it with nuclear power, and so on. But I mean, this is really, really huge. And some of the agreements, they had one of the people speaking, Alexei Likachov, who is the head of Rosatom, the Russian nuclear power agency, talked about the importance of nuclear power for the continent of Africa. And he said every dollar invested in these kind of power projects brings $2 more in to trade and the local economy. He said for every 0.5 megawatts of electricity, you get one new job. So if you're building a 2,000 or a 1,000 megawatt power plant, you're going to get 2,000 jobs out of that. He said that they are bringing students on scholarship. They already have 50 scholarships to students from Rwanda and Zambia, but there are students coming from Algeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa to Russia to learn to become nuclear engineers, to manage a nuclear industry. He said that in the next 2 decades, 15 to 20 million young people are going to enter Africa's workforce in the next 2 decades, meaning that 15% of the world's working age population will be in Africa, with 60% of them under the age of 25. I mean, so think about this. It is really short-sighted and myopic that people in the United States are not even remotely aware of the transformation that is occurring on a very large part of the planet. He said they signed an agreement to construct Rwanda's first center for nuclear science and technology, and one of the very important aspects of nuclear energy is not only the energy, but the isotopes that are produced for cancer research, cancer treatment, things like that. And then he also said that they are writing off $20 billion of debt. So contrary to the stupid lines in the United States about how China's making these big debt traps and Russia's making these big debt traps, he said we're going to write off $20 billion of debt from the Soviet era and embark on this. So this is really huge. Has anyone seen any coverage of this in the US press? Almost no mention, and I haven't seen any whatsoever. The article I'm quoting from is theworldnuclearnews.org. I mean, astounding. This is not minor. There are going to be billions of people involved in this. So that's first of all. Now, what's the backdrop of this? As we've been discussing, you have the blowout of the transatlantic financial system, and the Federal Reserve has now increased its overnight repo lending to $120 billion. Apparently the other night they needed something like $89 billion, and then their weekly rates have to be increased. So this is absolutely huge. And remember, this began September 16th into September 17th, because normally the big banks lend each other money overnight, but there is some zombie bank or banks who are going under, and the public is not allowed to know which ones, but they don't want to lend to each other anymore. So the interest rates went to 10%, indicating a lack of confidence, which meant that the whole system could have blown out. So the Federal Reserve has stepped in, printing money. Now, you know that Mark Carney, the current head of the Bank of England, was at a meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he and the other central bankers were saying basically we need regime change. And what he meant is no more governments, that the central banks have to take over the role of governments in making economic decisions. And think about the coup, the attempted coup going on against President Trump, but also the attempted destabilizations of China and other governments, and I'll get to that. And then you had Mervyn King, who was the former head of the Bank of England, and he said, we really have to get rid of these restrictions on the Federal Reserve. I mean, why don't we just completely open the spigots altogether and just print money like crazy? And I would say people should watch the documentary that we produced a few years ago called Firewall, which talks about Weimar Germany and the hyperinflation, where it got to such a point that the price of goods was literally changing while you were in the store. So if you wanted to get a second cup of coffee, the first one might have been $20 and the second one was $55. And people were literally running with wheelbarrows full of money from the moment they got paid to the store to buy whatever they could buy before the price went up. And then they gave up printing money. You just had to write numbers on a piece of paper and the whole system blew out. I'm not sure it would take exactly that form here, but you can think of what these people are thinking about. Paul Gallagher described it this way, which I thought was amusing. He said, since September 17th, the Fed keeps accelerating the liquidity bailout and keeps falling behind the problem. It is not just chasing ambulances, it's chasing hearses as the number of debt zombie companies pile up and produce zombie hedge funds and now likely new zombie investment firms. Now, what are they afraid of? Well, Mervyn King had expressed this. They're afraid that governments might come under pressure to not loot the population, but instead, as we should have done in 2008, let these criminal entities, these Jeffrey Epsteins of the world, pay. If they engaged in crazy activity, which would have been illegal before the repeal of Glass-Steagall or before some of these other regulations, they can handle the crash. People aren't going to die from that, but people are dying from lack of basic infrastructure, from lack of protection against hurricanes, from lack of maintenance of roads and bridges and tunnels. And that's the issue. So what is happening is that, oh, and by the way, Merv King also said, you remember Countrywide and Lehman Brothers? He said it was a terrible mistake in 2007 that we didn't bail them out. I mean, really, the whole thing, if you remember what happened in 2008 with the crash, I guess it was 2008, the American people were overwhelmingly opposed to the bailout. And they were calling the congressman, and congressmen reported getting 4,000 phone calls and emails a day to their offices. As one guy said, 50% of the people said no, and the other 50% said hell no. And they refused. And then what happened was Hank Paulson came into the Congress and threatened that there would be martial law, that you could not allow this sacred financial system to go under, and it had to be bailed out. And Barack Obama, who was then a presidential candidate, started calling members of the Black Congressional Caucus, arm-twisting people, saying, I'm going to be president. If you want to be able to work with me, you have to support this. And they rammed the first $700 billion through the Congress. And now we stand here $23 trillion later with a much bigger bubble of fictitious crap concentrated in the hands of fewer people, and it is going to blow. And what they want is they want a dictatorship. They want a fascist dictatorship. There's a very real link between the financial collapse of 29 through 32 and what happened in Europe with Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and the attempts to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt, thwarted by Smedley Butler, but to try and make the United States go fascist as well, which happily we did not. So what's happening? If you think about it, there are people in the streets all over the planet. Ecuador, Chile, France, Germany, Italy, Lebanon, Pakistan, everywhere. All the causes are not the same. I think in the case of Chile, you have a situation where the way the protest started, and I understand there were 1 million people in the streets there yesterday, one of the things they did was to raise the fares on all of the public transportation. So students, being the hardest hit, began jumping the turnstiles, and Chile, with its legacy of Pinochet, cracked down extremely violently and harshly. People died. And now every street corner, every night there are meetings. It is a mass protest going on there. In Germany, Mrs. LaRouche said this is not like previous farm strikes. You had farmers in, I forget how many towns, blocking the roads because between the economic collapse and all of this green crap where no one's going to be allowed to even own a cow and, have it eat grass or whatever they're saying, these farmers are going to completely lose everything. So it's a moment of desperation. In France, you had the police go on strike joining the firefighters because the police were being ordered to use the hoses of the firemen on the firemen to make the firemen come back to work, and they refused and went on strike. And it's similar. You can go one country after the next. The situation in Hong Kong is different because that is a destabilization being funded out of London and certain people here, and I wanted to share with you what I thought were really excellent comments from a spokeswoman of the Chinese government about Nancy Pelosi, who you may know was recently over there, along with Ted Cruz, AOC. They've all been giving their support to these wonderful, quote-unquote, nonviolent protesters who are about as nonviolent as the Nazis in the Maidan, who were setting the police on fire and storming police buildings and so on. So this is from Hua Chunying, the spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, in her press briefing on October 24th. She says, regrettably, she's talking about U.S.-China scientific cooperation and how necessary it is that you be able to have a free flow of ideas and discussion to make discoveries for the benefit of mankind. And then she says, regrettably, politicians like Ms. Pelosi are distorting facts and confusing right and wrong by whitewashing violent criminal offenses in Hong Kong as a nonviolent struggle and bolstering violent protesters who want to disrupt Hong Kong and China. Their hypocrisy and maliciousness are simply despicable and infuriating. The violent radicals in Hong Kong have been emboldened by the assurances of the likes of Ms. Pelosi through such stark, conniving, aiding, and abetting. I would like to remind Ms. Pelosi and her like that no matter how blinded you are by prejudice, no matter how your heart is filled with evil, do know this: Hong Kong is China's Hong Kong. Attempts to interfere in Hong Kong affairs or separate Hong Kong will never succeed. Such tricks might have worked elsewhere, but they will not work on Chinese soil, including in Hong Kong. And she also went on to criticize Vice President Pence's recent attacks on China, saying his remarks are full of arrogance, prejudice, critical biases, and lies. This is rather undiplomatic language. So you can think of how furious they are. And if you saw some of the video footage that's available of these protesters, like what happened when the police shot this young protester who was with a mob trying to bludgeon a police officer to death with pipes, you might appreciate their unhappiness about this. And it's also important for Americans to know that in China, and Bill may touch on this more, the population by and large, because so many hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in recent years, the population actually likes their government. It's hard for Americans to imagine because Americans feel, and it keeps being confirmed that we are right when you look at what the FBI and NSA and all these agencies are doing or what the Congress is doing. Americans don't tend to like our government. People like Trump because he's a maverick and not a politician, but they have great distrust in the government for good reason. But that is different in China. So people who think they're going to overthrow Xi Jinping are out of their mind, just like people who think they're going to overthrow Vladimir Putin are out of their mind, but it doesn't stop them from having these fantasies. Now, otherwise, I'll just say that breaking in the Trump case, I'm sure people heard that Barr and Durham are launching a criminal investigation, that finally the people who have been committing these crimes, Clapper, Brennan, hopefully Obama, Christopher Steele, Stefan Halper, that there is an intent to subpoena, convene a grand jury, file criminal charges. And I think this has moralized a lot of people who are hearing by the day the press says, and we finally have the smoking gun and Trump is guilty. And it's just complete crap. And the process that Nancy Pelosi has unleashed in the Congress has nothing to do with the Constitution whatsoever. It is not a legitimate impeachment proceeding. There is no vote. There are things behind closed doors. People may have heard the Republican members of Congress actually did a sit-in at one of these events. So there is a fight where we have been telling the truth about this situation for quite some time, but Ukraine and what happened in Ukraine will be pivotal. And the truth of that matter is there was no quid pro quo on that phone call between Trump and Zelensky. The quid pro quo was Biden, who bragged on television about withholding $1 billion of aid from Ukraine if Ukraine would not drop the investigation of his son's company. And this also has to do with the economy, but all of these things can come to light. Finally, what I just wanted to say, similarly in the fight back against this witch hunt, what I think is very important, Mrs. LaRouche has made the point that people should subscribe to our daily alert. We lowered the price of it from $100 a month to $50 a month because it's 5 days a week intelligence which people will never get otherwise, and that the US media does not exist. We do not have a news media in this country. We have articles that are paid for by public relations firms on the orders of our intelligence agencies. Think about it. How could Brennan, the former head of the CIA, end up at CNN? Josh Campbell, who was like Comey's right-hand man, ends up at MSNBC. Is that right, or do I have it backwards? I don't know, whatever. Anyways, the idea that you have the top, I mean, we attack other countries or accuse them of not having free and fair press. How about our press, where you openly have the tops of various intelligence agencies openly taking over the media? And this was made very, very clear in the latest revelations in the Flynn case from Flynn's attorney, Sidney Powell. She has filed a new motion, but I think what people really ought to consider is she exposes David Ignatius of the Washington Post taking orders from James Clapper on when to publish an article which, to quote, this is what Clapper called Ignatius and said to him, quote, take the kill shot on Flynn. That was January 10th, 2017, and 2 days later, David Ignatius runs an article on January 12th. So when people say, well, how can you say the press is lying? I mean, you can't mean all the press are lying. I mean, that can't be the case. Or we used to get it when LaRouche was being slandered, and they called him all these names and said he was a right-wing extremist, a left-wing extremist, an anti-Semite, a racist, a this, a that, stole $30 million. And I remember vividly having conversations, and people would say, well, but I mean, okay, so maybe that's not completely true, but where there's smoke, there's fire. Say, no, it was made up entirely from whole cloth. There is no truth to it whatsoever. And that's the situation with the press coverage of the so-called impeachment, the witch hunt, as President Trump has correctly called it, against President Trump. And what everyone here has to be very clear about is that we are not going to address it by proving that a crime was not committed. The people running this know that Trump did not commit a crime. The people who went after Lyndon LaRouche knew that he did not commit a crime. They didn't care about that. They cared about their power to impose a policy and make people through fear or and fear of all kinds of things, not even your job or this or that, but just that someone might look at you cross-eyed or you might lose your best friend or whatever, that people would go along with it. And this is why we keep making the point that if you really want to stop the coup and allow the United States to prosper and be an important part of the new paradigm that is emerging, as we see with these developments between China, Russia, and Africa, and it's going on in many, many places. I think it's over 150 nations now that are part of the Belt and Road. If we are going to successfully bring the United States into that Lyndon LaRouche absolutely has to be exonerated, and everyone should join with us in working to that end. So that's what I have, and I think Bill Jones is probably here to say some things to us.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be with you today. Just to let you know, I have something of a cold. I was at a 5-day conference, and I must say 5-day conferences are often too long. And when you have 5,000 people going to the conference, there are obviously some who have some bacteria, and you're lucky if you don't pick it up. And often enough you do, and this is what happened to me. So I'm a little hoarse today, and I have my tea here, which I drink when I'm sick. So if I take a bit of tea during the time of speaking, don't take that amiss. I just want to say a few things about this conference because it has an effect. It gives a good description of the situation that we're facing, the problems we're facing, and also the opportunities we have in the organizing, which I think are very important for all of you who will be out on the streets in the next weeks to talking to the American people. It was a meeting of the International Astronautical Federation, or it's called the International Astronautical Congress. It's held every year. Its origin was in this organization called the International Astronautical Federation, which was founded in 1951 by a small group of people in Paris, including Wernher von Braun, Eugen Zenger, Kraft Derrick, who was a member. I don't remember if he was at the founding conference, but it was a small group of people who wanted to create a dialogue among the scientists who were interested in astronautics. And of course, with the development of the space program, this is, burgeoned into just a tremendous audience every year. They have a Congress every year in different parts of the world. In 1992, Marcia Freeman, my wife, and I were at the Congress in Washington. It was the last time the Congress was in Washington. And she was kind of taken up by some of the colleagues of Wernher von Braun and became a member of the history committee at the IAF and has been, working with them ever since on that. So we go to this thing every year. It's always very exciting because it gathers all of the major scientists and engineers from all over the world who are involved in space. And there are small sections going on for 5 days. There are 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 different sessions going on simultaneously. And so there's a lot of information that's brought out there and a lot of more exciting ideas in terms of space, which we can see. And every year, of course, is very important. It was in Washington this year, partially because this is the Apollo anniversary. And Apollo was a big item on the agenda of the Congress. And the remaining Apollo astronauts, some of them were there, including Buzz Aldrin, as well as the son of Neil Armstrong and the grandson of Mike Collins, the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts. And so people were looking back, and there was a great deal of excitement because the United States has reinvigorated NASA. The commitment of President Trump to go back to the moon has excited everybody throughout the country of all ages, and it also excited the NASA administrator, the new NASA administrator, who himself is probably one of the most excited enthusiasts for it, who spent a lot of time press conferences talking to people answering questions, explaining what the program is that the United States is putting forward, and really trying to, build an opinion and support for what he's doing. Now, there are problems with the program that the United States has put forward, and problems that are going to have to be resolved if it's going to be successful. Nevertheless, the fact that that is now on the table, I think, has changed the entire situation here in the United States, creating a sense of enthusiasm that we haven't seen for a very long time. And it was also reflected in the conference. They have, in addition to the sessions, to the discussions, there is also an exhibition hall where private industry can come and show what they have. Private industry and governments can come and set up their exhibits to show what they are doing in space. And over the last 10 years or so, prior to the Trump administration, it was sometimes even difficult to find the NASA exhibit. It was so small, it was so insignificant, because we really weren't doing anything in space at the time. This was different this time. It was a very big exhibit, garnering a lot of attention. The major things that happened here: one, there is an address by an official from the host country. The second thing is that there is, on the first day, a meeting of the heads of agencies from all the major space agencies, from NASA, Japan, ESA, India, and China. China, of course, was not a spacefaring nation in 1992. That's when they decided they would be that, but they have since played a major role, and there have been two conferences, IAC conferences in Beijing. One, of course, which was addressed by the President Jiang Zemin in, I believe, 1999. And so it's a very prestigious. This year, it was addressed by Mike Pence. Now, Mike Pence was named by President Trump to be the head of the National Space Council. This is not so much because he's such a space enthusiast or he knows anything about it. It was because tradition has it from President Kennedy, who made Lyndon Johnson the head of the National Space Council, that the vice president would take this role. So he came to address the conference, and his address really rained on the parade of enthusiasm that existed there. If I want to be gross, I would compare it to somebody who coming to a banquet and placing a turd on the salad. People around you see that something was placed on the salad, not knowing exactly what it was, and then, of course, they noticed the smell. This was exactly the type of thing that happened when Mike Pence addressed the conference, because what he said was, greeted with enthusiasm in the beginning, the representative of the United States space program. And he said that we are going to go back to space. More than that, he said we will be leading in space. And he reiterated this numerous times, that the United States will be the leaders in space. He said we will cooperate, but we will cooperate with so-called freedom-loving nations. And who are these freedom-loving nations? Obviously, it's not China, because China is not considered by Pence and his people as being a freedom-loving nation. But is Russia a part of it? Is India? Are other countries that don't exactly have what the United States considers some kind of a Jeffersonian democracy in the Arab world? Are they a part of this? This was very unclear, but it was reiterated time and time again. Mike Pence wanted to make this point, and the point was that we will lead, we will be in charge, and we will write the program for everybody who's involved in this. In addition, he took up this whole notion of the Space Force, which has been announced by Trump. But what is the Space Force? Well, for Pence, this was the force that will, when we establish this community of freedom-loving nations, on the moon, or wherever, the Space Force will be kind of the guardian of it all. The idea you get is that he wants to create this Roman Empire, creating the limits, what they used to call the limes, in which the peace-loving nations are inside, and the barbarians remain on the outside. And this is how the world is to be organized. This medieval vision is probably not totally totally in contrast to Mike Pence's own persuasion, political and religious and philosophical persuasion. But it caused a bit of a furor, and nobody walked out, as far as I could see. Maybe some people did. There had been protests about Pence addressing this even prior to the conference. But you could hear in the applause every time he mentioned the freedom-loving nations, the United States will lead, the applause was less and less and less and less. Reaction afterwards, of course, was that everybody was really appalled by the speech that he had given, including among those so-called freedom-loving nations that are supposed to be a part of this. Obviously, it did not go well for that perspective. The second thing that happened had to do with this, with the meeting of the heads of agencies, because all of the heads of agencies were up on the stage. The United States, ESA, the European Space Agency, Japan, India, and China was not there. And everybody looked at that and of course, was concerned about that. And it was kind of interesting because the speakers, including the hosts, knew that that was the case and probably knew that that was what people were most concerned about, but they didn't want to talk about it. So, but you had the kind of situation where with 5,000 people, you don't have people in the audience raising their hands and getting them speaking. What they do is they get on the app, and the app is shown on the in the back of the board behind the speakers with the questions, and all of the questions. Where is China? Will we cooperate with China? Is China a part of this conference today? Have they, been axed out? These kind of things came up, and of course they had to address it. And what they said, or what the chairman of the heads of agency, the moderator of the heads of agencies panel said, was that there was a problem, a scheduling problem. But of course, what we saw, within the next few hours, is that these guys had just not gotten their visas in time, and given the level of people that were going to be coming, this obviously was a diplomatic operation, and it caused a lot of problems. Bridenstine was confronted by this afterwards. And he was very defensive. And, he said, I thought they would be coming and I thought they would be here. And I had no idea. And he said he would do anything to intervene to try, if there were problems with the State Department or something. And maybe that's what happened that day, because by the third day they had gotten their visas. They didn't play a very public role. There were people there. They didn't make an issue of it. They didn't, as far as I know, talk about it, but they were there. But this, of course, was a very important diplomatic, I would call it a faux pas, but I think it was intentional. And it was intentional because of the attitude that they're showing on China. What happened during the course of this, of course, was on the one hand, there was the reaction by all the people, about the insanity of this. For the for the space community generally, it has always been an issue that space is a unifying force, that all countries who are spacefaring nations should be involved in cooperation. And the attempt to try and make this into a partisan issue, or to create a space alliance, which is aimed at other countries that are also spacefaring nations, is really totally anathema, totally forbidden. And so people reacted very strongly in that. Most interestingly enough, although not unusual for him, Buzz Aldrin also, in his own way, without directly confronting Pence or anything, made it very clear in the few times that he spoke at the conference. And of course, because it was Apollo was a focus, there was also a focus on Buzz Aldrin, who was really the only Apollo 11 astronaut who was there. And he said quite clearly on the third, on before the conference, on an Academy Day, which is a day they have the day prior to the conference, and then towards the end of the conference, in an address at a major assembly meeting with several thousand people there, he made it very clear that what is needed is an alliance of space nations, which includes the United States, Japan, China, Russia, and India, to get together to do this project to go back to the moon. And this is what his intention was, and it's important, given Buzz has a lot of different ideas, all of which are not, really doable, but he represents that Apollo generation, and you've got the younger generation, not just the millennials now, but the 20 somethings, and the youngest person who asked the question of Bridenstine was 7 years old. And there were two young kids who were there. One asked if is there an age limit? Can kids go? When will kids be able to go to space? And the other was a young girl who asked if they had chosen a woman to go to the moon yet, probably with expectations that she might have a chance at some point. So you have this tremendous amount of enthusiasm, and you have this insanity, which is coming out of this fifth column. I would say the fifth column within the Trump administration that really wants to undermine everything that Trump is trying to do with this program. The fact of the matter is that most of the countries who are to be targets of this so-called space alliance are not willing to follow the lead of the United States. Russia, there was a Russian astronaut there. There was not the head of Roscosmos, the head of the space agency. There was not the head of Energia. None of the top level people in Russia came because they were told not to come to the United States, not to come to Washington. And there had been an incident just a few days ago where a Duma member who did come to the United States was stopped at the border by the FBI, interrogated for several hours, and this caused a tremendous uproar in Moscow. So they felt that this is not terra firma for them, and so they sent a lower level. But you had Sergei Krikalev, who I think spent the most time in space of any astronaut, a cosmonaut, and he was there, and he was speaking. They're willing to be partners, but they're not going to follow the lead of the United States. They, I think, are invited to be a part of this gateway project of the U.S., but they made it very clear, if this is something that the U.S. is leading and we are following, this is not what we want to do. We have an independent capability. Russia is a proud nation. Gagarin and the Sputnik are part of Russian history, an important part of Russian history. They're not going to be followers of anybody on that, but they do want to partner. Everybody wants to partner with the United States. China wants to partner with the United States, but they're being restricted from doing that. And this is the problem that we're seeing right now, and this is a problem that we really have to solve. And I think the solution has to do with the enthusiasm over the space station and the fact that people are looking back to the Apollo generation to find guidance, how they did the tremendous things that they did. And I think this is very important, because it means that a lot of the younger people now, look, we had people call the World War II generation the greatest generation, and I guess in many respects it is, although going back, maybe we'll find the Civil War generation and others. But I think it has a tremendous effect because it was different. They were people who fought a war. They were people who defeated an evil to humanity through the fight that they had in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. And people are looking back to their generation. The Apollo astronauts, they were not World War II veterans, they were Korean War, but it was the same culture. And of course, as we know, that culture has really degenerated. And, the boomers were totally at a loss. And of course, as we know of the boomer generation who came into contact with that World War II generation through the work of Lyndon LaRouche, that this really was a saving grace, because we understood to some extent what that generation was about. We knew that it wasn't our generation, but that it was something that one should strive after. And if you have a situation where people are looking back at the great moments that the United States has contributed, including Apollo, which Arthur Schlesinger felt was, the greatest achievement of mankind during that century, then they have to really understand also what LaRouche is all about, because in one sense, he was the greatest of the greatest generation in that sense. His accomplishments, his attitude, his unyielding fight for the benefit, for the good of mankind, it was absolutely incomparable. So as people today in this Apollo celebration are looking back at that, we have to make sure that they are aware of what Lyndon LaRouche was doing, what he said, and what solutions he had for the country as the country is trying to find a new direction. So I think that's part of the role we have to do, and the exoneration campaign is the way of doing it. It also is a way of, I would call it also saving Trump, because he's got the right inclination. He tends to move in the right direction, not through a thought out policy, but because his instincts are good. His instincts on creating a relationship with China's president, on creating a good relationship with Russia are good. But he's surrounded by these madmen, this fifth column, which are just trying to undermine everything he's doing. So that, the exoneration of LaRouche would kind of open up a whole world of new ideas and an entirely new situation for the United States if he dared to do that, and would kind of put these guys pretty much in their place. So it's also an attempt to save the Trump administration from what otherwise could be a disaster, not only from what the Democrats are trying to do with the impeachment, which I think is not going to succeed, but more importantly from the enemy within the administration, which he's not as clearly aware of as he is of the Democrats. The other thing I might mention that Diane talked about, how the Chinese are reacting to this situation, and how there's all this propaganda against the Confucius Institutes and Chinese cooperation in space, is that there are more restrictions being placed also on Chinese diplomats. The Chinese ambassador Sui has been doing a lot of work, talking with governors, going around the country, trying to talk up China, what China is trying to do, among people who will listen. And there are a lot of people who will listen at the local, at the regional, at the state levels. The governor of Kentucky is a good friend. He was at a conference on that. But now they're being restricted. Now, not so much forbidden to going out, but now they always have to tell the State Department, where are we going? Who are we going to meet with? Giving state the options of going to these people ahead of time, saying, hey, you don't want to do this or talk to this person. So in one sense, because that's being put up, our role should be to try and be a kind of a surrogate in organizing the support for China in the United States, and letting, and trying to tell the program what China wants while these diplomats are being, their hands are being tied by the State Department. During the World War II and afterwards, there was what was called the China lobby, which was an attempt by the KMT to talk up Chiang Kai-shek. But we have to have, it's not a China lobby, it's, I guess today, a Taiwan lobby. But we have to have something like that. We have to get the people, well-minded people, to understand the importance of the U.S.-China relationship and to try and talk to people at the state and local levels, and to have them, have an effect on the national government. We used to do these memorials. So and so state legislators would say we should have a memorial for, freeing Lynn, or things like that. We could do that with the contacts that we have at the state and local levels to try and get something moving. Memorials calling for the United States to lift the Wolf Amendment, to try and work together with China on this. And that's another aspect, I think, which would be significant to talk about. And with that, I'll rest my feet.
Great. Thank you. So now we'll hear from Jason Ross. I'll just say Bill is going to stay on, so if you have questions for him or things you'd like to hear about, save those, and we'll take that up after Jason's presentation. I'm moving, so I want to see what you're doing.
All right. Actually, I'm going to go over here first, Dave, just so we can start by seeing it. Oh, I'm taking the microphone. Okay. So I just... we're going to be talking about a few things, but I wanted to start... Oh. But I wanted to start with... your head's going to be in the shot. So just take your head off, please. Oh, should have warned. Okay. So we're going to start by taking a look at something and see if we can figure out why what we see is occurring. Here is... there's water in here, and this is a laser pointer. Please do not shout out your answers. Just think about them. You can shout them inside your head all you want. Okay? No, we're keeping it right here because it's going to be for just a minute. Okay. So if I move it back and forth, you can see the path that the light's taking here. So right now, it's going into the water and it's going straight down. Okay, not a surprise. Let's take a look from the side now. So the light's coming in, it goes to the water. You can shout this out. Did it go in a straight line? No. It bent. Wow. Okay. Let's try it over here. Let's see what happens. Straight line? No. Okay. Right. The straight line would have come out to about here. You can see where it is, and it's actually there. Okay. Let's see if this works from going inside the water here. It's kind of hard to see, isn't it? Let's try it again. Can you see the angle? Can you see it bending? Might be hard. Let's try it from way over here. Here it's basically just reflecting. You see it, now the water is acting like a mirror. At this angle, it's still kind of acting like a mirror, but you can see some of the light gets out. It comes up out of the water. So that's interesting. Why, when it's way over here, why is the light stuck inside the water here? And here it's able to get out. Why does it go in a straight line here, but curve in this case? Oh, no, we're just going to keep it in mind. Write down your thoughts. We are going to come back to it. It wasn't just like let's warm up our minds for a moment here. Okay. So we're going to talk about intention. We're going to talk about the intention of light, and we're going to talk about the intention of economies and the intention of the LaRouche movement. And this will all be done very quickly because we've got a lot to talk about, and I know people have questions for Bill. I want to show a few pictures. This is from a gathering that took place, was it just last weekend? 2 weekends ago. Last weekend. Amazing. This is a partial photo. We had a youth event, like a youth retreat, you might call it, or a youth offensive, if you prefer, or a gathering last weekend, where we were doing things. We were working on music. Here we go. We had classes and discussions on science, on economics, We watched videos to learn more about Lyndon LaRouche. We did geometry together. We spoke with our international colleagues. Here we are with a video connection with Carolina in Mexico City, talking about what it's like to organize in Mexico City compared to the US. We had our colleagues from Germany on as well to get a sense of what it's like around the world. There's many different countries. And part of what we were doing with the weekend was implementing an idea of creating a movement that is political, that is creating an economic renaissance, that is hoping and working to embody the seeds of creating a cultural, musical, knowledge, a renaissance. In other words, we want to get in touch with and encounter what it is that makes us all human, with that creative ability that differentiates us from the animals and allows us to have better and better living standards generation to generation, while the animals just do the same thing over and over again. Unless we train them, and then they do those things over and over again. So that's what we're going to talk about. What is it to know something? What's the nature of our knowledge? In what sense do the ideas that we have cohere with the ideas that nature has, or if you like, that God has? How are our thoughts related to whatever it is that actually makes things happen out there in the real world? And do we really need the human mind to do all of that? This we're not going to talk about that much today, but I know there's a lot of people who say that the human mind is unnecessary. Have you heard this? Oh yeah? I thought artificial intelligence is going to take over everything. All of our jobs will be displaced by robots. They will be our new rulers. Some people lose sleep over this. I don't, but you know, the human mind is necessary, and animals also will not be able to take up the task that we've got here. So two examples here about intention, coming off of a couple of quotes from Lyndon LaRouche from a paper that he wrote about 15 years ago called Visualizing the Complex Domain. LaRouche wrote, "In the fundamental discoveries of universal physical principle, the individual creative mind is acting in individual relationship to the physical universe. In the principles of classical artistic composition, the individual is acting in an emotion-driven relationship to the principles of those social processes through which society cooperates in the application of discovered universal principles." Some forms of musical composition don't seem to have this as their goal. The benefits of those activities are the only actual source of what should be regarded as the physical form of economic profit by society. There is no other source of true and legitimate profit than the combined benefit of the action of discovering and adopting these two kinds of universal principles. Learning how to avoid paying taxes is not a true and legitimate source of profit. Learning how to invest on the markets is not the overall source of profit. It's creating universal physical discoveries, and in the second case, developing the principles of artistic classical composition. So let's take two examples of the first case, of physical discovery. The first is Johannes Kepler, and the second is Pierre de Fermat. Kepler was the first modern scientist. He was the first astronomer to really figure out how the planets moved, and it's because he took a totally different idea about what knowing means. One of his predecessors was named Ptolemy. Has anybody heard of him, Ptolemy the astronomer? Name ring a bell? What's he famous for? Anybody know? What was anything about his...
The center of the universe.
He said the Earth is the center of the universe. So here's a picture of his model. We've got the Earth right in the middle there, and around it, it's a little bit hard to read, but we've got the Moon, Mercury, Venus, then the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the firmament. So that's the universe. The Earth's in the middle. So let me ask, is he right? Does anybody think that Ptolemy is right? That the Earth is the unmoving center of the universe? Nobody. Okay. I'm a little disappointed, but that's okay. Why did you not hold your hands up? How do you know that he's wrong? There's more than one right answer, but would anybody like to say why they didn't hold up their hand? The teacher taught you?
We have seen pictures of around
Space travel? We've seen pictures. Well, he didn't think the Earth was flat. The Earth was round. He just thought it wasn't moving. So do we have pictures that let us know the Earth is moving? We do? Okay. What are those? How do the pictures show that? Well, what do we see in them that lets us know the Earth is in motion?
seasons.
Oh, Ptolemy had the seasons. No, that's just depending on how you make the sun move around the Earth. That's no problem. Well, I mean, at least I don't know how. How do the seasons let us know that the Earth is moving?
Relationship to planets like Venus changes all the time.
The relationship to planets such as Venus changes all the time. And that means that the Earth has to move?
Something has to move.
Oh, yeah, well, Ptolemy, he said everything else moves. So he says the sun moves around us, Venus moves around us. Plenty of things move, just not the Earth. Has anybody ever felt the Earth move? Maybe in California? Okay. Supposedly, does anybody know how fast the Earth is supposedly moving around the sun right now? Pretty fast, right? Does anybody feel that? 66,000 miles. That's pretty fast. I mean, it's pretty smooth ride. I don't know. I'm not. If it was per mile, I'd definitely feel it a mile. But if it's kilometers, maybe we wouldn't. It's pretty fast either way. So maybe he is right. It seems like there's not much of an idea of what's wrong. I mean, unless I missed something. I mean, I've seen pictures that make the Earth look round for sure. That I've seen. Okay. Well, will anyone like to raise their hands now? Maybe he is right. Does anyone think the Earth is stationary? Okay, tough crowd. All right. Okay, maybe you've heard of this fellow, and maybe you think his product is a little bit superior. Copernicus. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Raise your hand. Have anyone heard of Copernicus? So what did he do? What was his great idea? The sun's in the middle. Here it is. Nice sun. And then around it goes Mercury, then Venus, then the Earth, with the moon going around the Earth, Jupiter, Saturn, so forth.
How did he conclude to create this? What was his observation? How did he figure it out?
Does anybody know? What made Copernicus think he was right?
Maybe because Mercury never went around the Earth, it just went around the sun?
It does stick near the sun. That's some observational support for it. Whenever you see Mercury in the sky, you never see it at midnight, for example. Mercury is always kind of close to the sun. You might see it early in the morning, or, you might see it right at dawn or at dusk. That's about the only time you see Mercury. So that's suggestive. Now, Ptolemy figured out a way to make Mercury always be near the sun, though. Their motions just happened to coincide, so Mercury happened to always kind of be near the sun. That was his view. Were there some other observations that could prove this is right, and that the Earth being in the middle, unmoving, is wrong? Well, let me ask this. By a show of hands, Copernicus, sun-centered planetary system. Our sun is named Sol. It's called a solar system. Is Copernicus right? Does anyone think Copernicus is right? Is the sun the unmoving center of our solar system? Some people are, okay, pretty much unmoving. Does the Earth go around the sun?
Yes.
Okay, so I see we got a lot of people that haven't weighed in one way or the other yet. And again, how would we know? So here's the thing with Kepler. Actually, I'm missing a slide. what's amazing is that in his big book, and it's a very big book, where he, but not too big to be able to read, where he figures out how the planets move, he begins it not by saying that Copernicus is right, although he thinks he is. He actually says that there's no observation that would prove Copernicus is right. He said that even though Copernicus's math worked better, and it told you more accurately where the planets would be, you could just adjust Ptolemy's model and get the same kind of good results. What he said was that there was something wrong with both of them, and with everyone else who had ever tried to figure out the planet's motion, which is that no one before Kepler tried to figure out why anything was moving in the first place. So Copernicus said things are moving around and the sun is near the middle. He didn't really get into why. Ptolemy didn't get into why anything was moving. He said things move, they move in circles. Copernicus just said, well, you know, nothing's better than a circle, nothing's more perfect, so everything moves in circles, or circles on circles on circles on circles, or however many circles you need. Circles make things move. Have you ever seen a circle do any work or make anything happen? What makes things happen? Does a circle make a car go down the street? Yeah, the engine makes the car go down the street. Okay, so as far as the planets go, Kepler said, well, we're never going to answer this unless we talk about cause. Why are the planets moving? In fact, why are there this many planets and not a different number of planets? Why do they have these speeds instead of others? He wanted to find out all of the causes here. And because he succeeded in that, he did figure out how the planets moved. And that's not the main thing we're going to talk about, so I'm just going to leave that there. Although, I got to say, when the uncertainty that we had about whether the Earth moves, do you think if we went to one of these climate strikes, we would get a lot of very good and reasonable explanations of how we know that the Earth is moving if we asked participants there? No. People don't even know if the Earth's moving or if the sun's moving, but they know how the whole Earth works and what the impact of CO2 will be on the temperature, hands down, right?
The drugs.
Okay. You're right. You heard it from somebody. Here's the other question, refraction. This poor duck has not been sliced in half. It's just a trick of the photo. It's in the water, you see. And so the angles look different, like the straws. These are actual photos. And this is like what we saw with the laser in the going into the water. Light bends, its path changes. Here's another picture. Look at that. So now that we are looking at pictures, what's going on here? Anybody have an idea?
The speed slows down when light goes through different density objects.
And why?
Gas and water are different density.
Right. Why does that make it change its direction and not just its so maybe it changes its speed. Why does it also change?
It's a harder work. So because that.
Oh. So I get it. It's hard to move through things. Moving through water is hard. I definitely can walk faster than I swim. I can't even move through this at all. It's very hard. But why didn't it just go at the same direction but slower? Why did it also say, oh, I'm going to bend?
Easier path of resistance?
Easier path of resistance?
Worse. There's a more resistance, and that's why it changes the angle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with light and sound, the premise is the same. So when my voice projects, it goes like this.
Mm-hmm.
But with light, it travels faster than sound. But much like on water, you have the density, which makes it bend. The density of the water makes the light bend. With the metal object, I don't grasp that as much, but that's my understanding of why the light bends.
Okay. Let's look at where this idea came from, because this is a tough problem, and people were sure trying to figure, obviously, it's hard to miss this, so people have been trying to figure this out for a long time, and the first publication of anything printed that actually explained it fully was in the 1600s, or that wrote a formula down for it was in the 1600s. Here's just a couple more pictures of it. Okay, so let's start with Descartes. Descartes was the, those are my notes, sorry. Descartes, I bet people have heard of Descartes, right? And if you learned about him in philosophy class, you probably just had to remember one sentence of his to, connect a line to his name. Anyone have any thoughts on Descartes? What's he famous for? No. Maybe he's not that famous. Okay, anyway, supposedly he's this real smart guy. Here's what he had to say about light and water. He said that, first off, he built up some physical intuition. So he said light is like a tennis ball, except it also doesn't have any speed, but it's also like a tennis ball. And so when it enters the water, it slows down. Let's say if, well, Descartes thought it sped up, but you think it slows down, so I made this picture for you. I read your mind in advance. So if the ball never entered the water, it would just continue going to the right the same as it had before. We'll watch this again. If we look up at the top, this ball up here, its speed doesn't change. It's just going horizontally the same. So if the tennis ball never touched the water, it would just keep going to the right. So what Descartes says is that when it does go into the water, only the vertical speed changes, because only the fact that it was moving vertically made it touch the water at all. Therefore, only the vertical speed will change. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make any sense. No, it's pretty stupid, but that's what he said. Now, there's just one problem. Is this what we saw light do when it was in that water tank? Did it bend this way? No. Bends the other way. So if light slows down in water, it would bend like this. See, here's a little man playing tennis. This is from Descartes' book. And this is what really happens. So to resolve this problem, Descartes would say, well, I guess the light just has to speed up when it gets into the water. What would make it speed up when it got there, though? Descartes said, and I swear I'm saying this directly quoting from his book, or paraphrasing from his book. He says that when the light reaches the water, in order to go down this way, at the moment that it reaches the water, it's struck by a tennis racket and goes down. He didn't honestly believe there was a tennis racket that came out of nowhere and gave it a smack, but in his explanation, he says that this is basically what happens. And remember, if it never touched the water, the tennis racket would never have hit it. Therefore, its horizontal speed won't change, only its vertical speed will change. Makes sense, right? Descartes' a genius, okay? 97% of philosophers think he's very smart. So let's watch. Yeah, so only the vertical speed change, and that explains everything. This is pretty bizarre sounding, to put it mildly. And Fermat, he thought that this idea from Descartes was really stupid. And so he said, this seems impossible. He wrote some reasons why it just didn't make any sense, and then he just sort of put it away for a while. But he came back to the question a few years later when one of his friends wrote a book about light and sent it to him. And here's how his friend explained reflection. The fact that light, when it bounces off a mirror, comes off at the same angle that it hits the mirror. I'm going to walk over here and show that, but we don't need to, well, you can move the camera if you want. It's just a very quick demo. Oh, it's not bouncing at all. Can you see it right there at the boundary? Very minor. Bounces. Reflects at the same angle that it comes in at. Why? Well, here's what his friend said. His friend said that he was reading a story by the Greeks, not a story, but the physics of a Greek writer, who explained why it is that light, if it's going to go from one point to another, and it's going to bounce on the mirror somewhere, this is how a Greek whose name I forget explained it. They said, let's say it bounces at point C over here. Then its total path that the light traveled went from A to C to B. If we make a new point at the bottom, B prime, this length, A to C to B prime, it's the same as the length A to C to B. Either way, we've got to measure for the total distance that the light went. Now, if instead it goes to point L, then it's, don't worry, that line will come back. It's total path A to L to B. Well, that's the same length as A to L to B prime. And is there any shorter way to get from A to B prime than a straight line? That's the shortest way to get between the 2 points. And so that's why light reflects at equal angles, that it took the least distance to get from one point to another. Does that seem like it's a, what do you think about that compared to the tennis racket? Honestly asking, does that sound like it's physics, or does that sound strange? To say that light wanted to go in the least distance pathway.
Sounds plausible.
Plausible, okay. Well, how does the light know? When it left point A, did it know it was going to B? It's a little tough, isn't it? So here's what Fermat said. He said that, well, it's different with water, because light goes slower in water. Descartes said it moved faster, but Fermat says, well, everything goes slower in water, so light will also go slower. And so you'll see here is a bunch of little rays of light, all trying to go from the red spot to the blue spot, and their speeds are going to change. In the air, they're faster. In the water, they'll slow down. So here you can see they're off to the races, and let's see who wins. Let's watch that one more time. Okay. So that one in the middle on that brownish purple path, that got to the bottom the quickest. That was the shortest time pathway. Light got there the fastest. Fermat said that's why light moves. It takes the least time. It's not just geometry now, we got to bring in physics. We don't just have space and then time, we got to put them together, and we've got to have this cause that's kind of more like a human cause. You want to run an errand, you do it as quick as you can. And he's saying, well, that's how nature works too. Nature doesn't do things for no reason. Nature operates by an intention. That was his idea. Any thoughts about that? Does anybody think that that's true? That it's possibly true?
How did he measure the speed of water?
How did he measure the speed in air and water? Fermat didn't. At this time, no one had ever measured the speed of light. It's very fast. People had tried, but some of the things that they came up with to try it, it just wasn't good enough. Like one thing would be that if I turn on a flashlight and point it at you, and then you, as soon as you see my beam turn on, you turn on your flashlight, and I time between me turning mine on and seeing yours, I could do that in this room, and then maybe we could be on 2 different buildings across town, 2 tall buildings, and we could do the same thing, or 2 mountains, so we're real far apart. The thing is, light is so fast that these experiments didn't show anything, because the amount of time it takes to see the light and for you to flip your finger and then for me to see the light and hit the stopwatch is way longer than light. So Fermat he didn't know if this was true. He didn't know if light slowed down in water. He didn't know if it took any time at all. Most people thought that light moved instantly. His friend who wrote the book about the least distance thing, he thought Fermat was crazy. He said, good book, Fermat, but we all know light doesn't take any time to move.
Just, can you go back to the other? I mean, I was thinking through why that one. Somehow, it's like a balance or a harmonic proportion, because you want the light to be the longest possible time in the less dense area, and the shortest distance in the more dense area. So it seems to me there has to be some kind of ratio where this balances out.
Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe it looks like this path should have made one of them be completely straight. But let's say if we went right here, that would be definitely the shortest distance. But it spends a little bit more time in the water. This dark path spends a little bit more time in the air where it goes faster and only then enters the water. But if you go too far, you're just wasting so much time because you're saying, hey, look, I'm real quick here in the air. Okay, now I'll go down in the water. It's nice, you spent less time in the water, but the whole path is just getting so long that you lost your advantage. So there's one spot in the middle that's just right. And what Fermat did is, because he had made an advancement in math where he figured out how to find, for math problems, the best way of doing something. And so he figured out that if light goes in the least time pathway, he worked it out and he got the exact same formula as Descartes for how the angles were related. And he was really surprised. He said, wow, his theory made no sense. He thinks it goes faster in water, even though it's really instantaneous. I think it goes slower in water, but we both got the same formula. How is this possible? Leibniz later said that basically Descartes learned the formula from Snell, who actually discovered it at the university that Descartes was hanging out at, heard his lecture, wrote it down, and then made up some stupid explanation to get full credit. Right? He got the answer, and then he showed his work, and it made no sense. That was basic. That's sort of what happened here. So is that just one more ask, if this is possible? Can the idea that light takes the least time, is that part of physics, or is that the philosophy department? Okay. Well, Descartes' friends didn't think this made any sense. They said light doesn't know where it's going. You're attributing a human concept to light and to nature. Nature doesn't have an intention, they said. Nature just does from one moment to the next according to fixed rules. And you're bringing in this idea of an intention or of a goal. That has no place in physics, in nature, they said. So the two problems they had was that intention isn't part of nature and that thought isn't part of nature or anything like it. Fermat didn't think light actually thought about this. He didn't think light rays thought, just to be clear about that. Okay, we're not doing that. I'm just going to jump ahead about 80 slides here and say one more thing. Yeah, you know what? Actually, I think maybe we'll just, and that's why we need LaRouche's 4 laws. To have an intention for the country and for the economy. It's not enough to make some rules about how banking works or how finance works. You got to have an intention. So what that would mean for us today is having the intention of the Artemis program, of the space program, of going to the moon, industrializing it, developing nuclear rockets, going to Mars, utilizing the helium-3 that's in the lunar soil. That's an intention. Developing nuclear fusion, that's an intention. That goal in the future needs to guide what we're doing today. And people who say that that always fails, like economists or Jehovah's Witnesses, who say that you can try to plan about the future, but that is never any good, they're wrong. You can't just make a system. You gotta have an intent. You gotta have somewhere specific that you're going, and then you can work out a system to help make that happen. And that's what the policies that LaRouche wrote in his document on his 4 laws represent, and that's what we should do and create a mission for the country.
Why does it take you so long to apply Glass-Steagall? I thought when I was working for the bank that you should have done it then.
Well, okay. Well, the question was, why does it take so long to get Glass-Steagall? The questioner says when she was working at a bank, she thought it should have been done back then. Well, things take a little while.
I had to talk to the English bank. I work for the English bank, and I have to make a lawsuit because of that, because they didn't apply Glass-Steagall.
Mm-hmm. Yes, people should be at the microphone. Yeah, do you want? Huh?
Maybe some people have bad intentions.
Well, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. We don't have Glass-Steagall not because nobody thought about it, but because people don't want it. The British Empire doesn't want Glass-Steagall. They don't want Trump in office as the system collapses, as it could do any day. The question was, why do the British not want Glass-Steagall? Because that would be the end of their empire. So the modern British Empire operates not through its military in the way that it used to be known for, taking over parts of China, colonizing India. They work as a financial empire at this point, and their power lies primarily in people accepting them having that power. Part of that means tolerating a system where banks get whatever they need, are given incredible prerogatives and powers, and are not challenged. So if Glass-Steagall, when Glass-Steagall is implemented, a lot of these banks are going to end up declaring bankruptcy because they are bankrupt, and then they'll be forced to just say it, and we can reorganize things, and they will simply not have the power that they do today.
Who can,
Wait, can you go to the microphone?
it's a very
Sorry.
quick question.
Well,
I think-
it's not for us. It's because people who watch on YouTube, they're gonna. That's why. I mean, I can just repeat them, I guess. But think of the viewers. They'd love to hear your voice, if you please. You can ask your question. At the mic would be nice. But okay, thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm not
Oh, yeah.
sure if I fully understand the meaning of Glass-Steagall. This is my fault or weakness. But if something has a meaning, and you or other people believe it has a meaning, how come we cannot find a system or an entity or government or group that would institute or insist on having something which is meaningful? Who is there to make sure that it will exist and it will be functional?
Oh well, that's our job. I mean, that's everybody viewing this. It's your job. It's my job.
It's two broad answers.
So, no, the question is that it's a personal thing that people have to take up. There is no authority that we're going to appeal to who's going to say, oh my God, Glass-Steagall, never heard of it, great idea, love it, I'm going to make it happen. We have to do that. So the answer to your question is for every person viewing this in the room now, viewing this on the internet, what are you doing and what could you be doing to make it happen? Yes, please. Okay, moderator.
I'll say something also, maybe you can put Bill back up there, because I think China has something that he might want to say something about that is like a Glass-Steagall separation. For people who are not familiar, Glass-Steagall, the original law was very short, maybe 8 pages or something like that. And it's very specific, which is that commercial banks, savings and loan banks, do that. They protect your savings, they do mortgages, they may do small business loans. It is real, it is not fictional, it is not speculative. And the banks that want to invest, want to do things that are more risky, play the market, or now they have derivatives, you can gamble on the weather and almost anything else, that was kept entirely separate, and that was passed. FDR initiated this because of the blowout of the banking system in 1929 through 32. In 1999, thanks to pressure from Alan Greenspan and Citigroup or Citibank merging with Travelers Insurance, which would have been illegal under Glass-Steagall, the law was repealed. And in effect, what Merv and King is saying right now is we should not only not have Glass-Steagall, we should have no laws on anything. But the repeal of Glass-Steagall made it possible to do things like have Bank of America or other banks swallow the debt of Century, whatever that mortgage company was, or Lehman Brothers, and then your savings could be played with by the bank as collateral for all of this speculative garbage. So if you reinstate Glass-Steagall, the first thing that will happen is that there will be a massive deflation of this bubble of crap. And that will freak out a lot of people. It does mean that people's 401ks and different things in the markets may shrink dramatically because the market is way overinflated. And this is why you cannot simply reinstate Glass-Steagall without going to a question of a national bank and a full credit system, because there are things that are going to have to be bailed out in the real world. But it also means that the artificially high cost of everything, because the banks are right now looting us. People here might remember that when you had savings in a bank, you used to get interest. You used to get even 5% interest. Now you virtually have to pay for having the privilege of having your money in the bank. And then if you borrow, if you have a credit card, you can pay rates of up to 20%, 21%. Or 26, or if they decide your risk, it can go up to 29%. This used to be called usury. So Glass-Steagall, in a sense, is a principle, because if the government is going to issue credit, like you want farmers or people building giant industry and things like that to have access to loans where the interest rate is 1 or 2%, then the government wants to be able to direct credit through a system of banks that are not engaged in all this other garbage. And therefore, it's very critical. And we know that the British actually said that the instatement of Glass-Steagall, they would consider it an act of war, a casus belli, because it means you are saying that Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, all of these, what Mark Carney was defending, you're saying, whoop, and in one fell swoop, their power over this is gone. And that is why they will fight tooth and nail. And we saw, those of us, some people here who went to the Congress repeatedly to lobby for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, and many offices said, oh, funny you're here. We just had a delegation from Chase Manhattan Bank just in my office before you got here. I mean, it's a real fight. It's a real fight, a very, very big one. It's not just a word. So, Bill, I don't know if you have anything on that.
Yeah, I can just say that China is already, prior to opening up the market to the outside world, there was only really a state banking system. There was also kind of black market to some extent, but it was really controlled by the government. But of course, that wasn't always the most efficient way of doing things. And obviously, they were entering into the world market and also bringing in, private financing, setting up private banks, opening up to, international banks. And they were trying to design their system largely from imitating the better aspects of what the U.S. had done. And of course, this was in the 1990s. So, and Glass-Steagall was still intact in the United States. And part of this obviously was an example. I don't know if we even have the details on how that occurred. But during that period, of course, you could see on CCTV that they were talking about Glass-Steagall and how it worked. So it was obviously a matter of discussion, and they set up a system of regulation, probably largely reflecting this Glass-Steagall. However, things are changing a lot also in China. They're developing e-commerce. There's a new opening up. There's still, a lot of capital floating around there, which can become problematic. So they are in a constant fight and a constant attempt to maintain control of that. And the good thing there is that private capital does not control the economy. And that's always been the advantage that China had. The reason they weren't knocked out by the 1997 Asia crisis and could actually help to stabilize economies, and the fact that they weren't brought down by the 2008 crisis, was the fact that they weren't fully integrated into this international financial system. By 2000, they had joined the WTO, and they were into the trading system, but they were still very cautious about opening up their markets to full international transparency and entry of capital into the country. And that has been their strong point, because you do have entirely looking at what is in the interest of the people, which is determining state policy or government policy with regard to the regulation or new regulation. And you don't have that here. The banking system largely has been controlling the government, not vice versa. And that's really what has to be changed. By Glass-Steagall would be the first step to change that. And until we get to that point, it's troubling because this market is just totally out of control. So the Chinese are in relatively better shape. I wouldn't say that they're really in good shape, that they're well off, but they're in much better shape than the West. Although the effects of the trade crisis, the effects of the international financial fluctuations are problematic, but less problematic because they're moving away from the dollar and they're utilizing their own currency, the renminbi, for many of their transaction with the Belt and Road states, and that really kind of protects them against some of the things that might be going on in the international market. But they are affected by that. But they really have more control over their economy than we do here, and our problem is getting control over it and instituting the kind of necessary financial reforms, including eliminating a large portion of the unpayable debt. And until that's done, we are going to be in trouble. And we got to get the president, who's not very good on these economic issues, to understand that has to be done.
Other questions for Jason, Bill? Oh, okay, and then, okay, good.
To my recollection, Soviet Union didn't have a stock market. They didn't have Lehman Brothers. They couldn't come to a situation we had here. Okay. Now, there was somebody's decision to institute the so existing quasi-capital and create all these institutions. Okay. What's the value of having markets like stock markets and so on? So what is behind it? It's an empty concept. And
well,
I have to conclude that the only safe place to put my money to a bank would be somewhere in China, because it's state controlled.
Well, they're actually, I mean, Alexander Hamilton, I believe, was involved in the creation of a stock market, but there used to be a relationship between the productivity of your economy and a stock or a bond that was invested in a company to give it capital to grow. After the decoupling of the dollar from the gold reserve system and after the invention of other kinds of things where you could literally place a bet on a future. So you could bet that Trans World Airlines was going to go bankrupt or collapse, and you could make money on their collapse. And that would cause the market to go up, even though the company itself went out of existence. So what we've had, and that gets really to LaRouche's triple curve function. Do you know what that is? We've shown it. It looks like a trumpet bell with two curves that go up like this and one that goes down like that. And it starts in 1966, where all three curves are the same. But then as you get into this post-industrial economy and the speculation, what happens is the more money that you put into the market, the more you are literally taking out an inverse proportion from your physical economy. And it creates these two hyperbolic curves, which are like a shock front. And when you get to that, you have 2008. You have a collapse of the system. So that's where we are. Now, what you're saying about the Soviet Union is interesting because LaRouche warned them in 1983. It didn't have to do with the stock market. Actually, probably had something to do with the Strategic Defense Initiative, because unlike the US economy, when we had the crash program to go to the moon, that spilled over into everything. So we got Velcro and Teflon and laptops and microwaves and all kinds of things that elevated the platform. I guess Chase Econometrics put it into monetary denominations, which is really unfortunate, where they said $10 for every dollar invested, because I don't think you can really measure it that way, especially if you consider here we are 50 years after we went to the moon and we're still benefiting from what happened. But you got an enormous benefit. Whereas the Soviet economy You had enormous resources poured into making breakthroughs on defense and military, but they had tractors still from the 1940s. And the reason why the Soviets rejected Ronald Reagan's offer, which was LaRouche's proposal, which is the Soviet Union and the United States develop the Strategic Defense Initiative together, because that's the only way you could do it and maintain the balance. LaRouche said, if you don't do this with the United States, and you go off on your own to try and develop this technology, what you're going to end up doing is cannibalizing the rest of you're going to take all the resources from everything else, from industry and farming and so on, and try and develop this new technology. And LaRouche warned them in 1982-83 that they were going to go bankrupt and disintegrate within 5 years. So he was off by 1 year, but he knew exactly the impact that that would have, and that is what occurred. So there may be Jason, you want to?
Oh, no, I think Darwin.
Oh, Darwin? Okay, and then I know Ann. You had a question, Darwin?
Well, you basically answered my question. I've been on Wall Street for the past couple of days, passing out flyers and showing the LaRouche magazine. And Friday, a banker came up to me, and we got into it over the Glass-Steagall Act. And the thing about the Glass-Steagall Act is it came with the New Deal that Roosevelt put together, and in 1933. So I know between 1933 and 1936, the New Deal was being in place in America after the 1929 stock market crash. But in 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act was incorporated, was it through
It was 32.
32?
It was very soon, wasn't it? Right after he came in? Oh, yeah, you're right. Thank you, you're correct.
Okay.
I was thinking it was 32. Yeah, it was April of No, you're right. I always, thank
But,
you. Yes, you're right, 33.
So I know it was 1933, and I forget the guys who, one was Glass and the other guy was Steagall.
Yes.
And they put the bill together, and I think it was with 30 people from Congress, something to that effect. But
I don't know how many.
we were sitting there, and he was going, well, one of the big things is that, I invest in green technologies, and one of the things about putting that in together is that we don't want to compete with each other, and we feel that it would be better to keep it hush-hush that we don't want to compete. And that's basically what the argument came out to be. There was a lot of flags
So
thrown
he was
around.
sort of admitting that the whole system is rigged.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. That's basically how we started clashing over it. But it was a very good conversation.
Well, it's interesting you brought up the green, because that is the point. I mean, that's the bubble. Do you want to say more about that as the co-author of that new pamphlet?
What the green is and the Green New Deal?
Yeah.
Well, okay, it's one thing. I mean, there is a huge impetus, there's a major grouping in Wall Street and in London that's backing the Green New Deal. It's saying, oh, this is great, we got to force governments to invest in this green technology. We got to make sure every company inspects how green its policies are, how much climate risk there is with its investments, and this should just be required everywhere. By the way, our consulting firm can help create all those numbers for you. And so there's two things about this. Part of it is this people trying to make money? Yes, some people are trying to make money. But the higher level on this is that this banking, the people who are like, the people making some hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in the banking sector, making all this stuff happen, they're not leading this at all. At the top level, the racist, eugenicist, population reducers who created the World Wildlife Fund, Nazis, racists, British oligarchs, royals, they still have the same goal, which is to reduce the world's population, to prevent development, to keep people poor, under control, and not have too many human beings on the earth. So, you get a sort of funny confluence with the Green New Deal, where it is a kind of a shocking thing to see, because people are told that, finance and industry and business is destroying the planet and we got to save it. And you're like, well, why is it that all the biggest banks love the Green New Deal? I thought they were the ones destroying the planet. That's sort of, anyway.
Yeah, that was a bit the biggest part of my question to the guy was, he basically stated that, and what I basically got out of it is that number one, America is 243 years old. We were derived of European descent, and one of the major things about the U.S. is that during the time of the Glass-Steagall Act, we were majorly neutral we were majorly neutral to war during the World War II era. So in 1947, when the Bretton Woods system was put into place, we started sending things out of space. So from my understanding as a younger generation person, I graduated in 2000. So from my understanding of today's market, because I grasp the stock market very well, because I've been reading the Wall Street Journal for about 20 years. So one thing that I grasp about economics and filtering technology through them is that somebody's going to take the blunt of something somewhere. I mean, and one thing with technology is that the consumer is always past the problems of a technology. So whenever the Bretton Woods system was destroyed when we came down from the moon, that was one thing that we had got into too, was that the gold standard should be reenacted. And this is one thing that I was telling this guy, I'm like, well, it's great that you guys want to bet. And I'm like, I'm not saying that it's not okay to go to a hobby shop that is a casino, really, but I think that it would be better for the consumer if you guys competed. And they was like, well, we don't want a wall between two banks because, if the dollar gets too strong, it's going to be terrible for the rest of us. So it's better that we keep a floating rate. And so we stood out there for 10 minutes or so going over this. And that's basically, from my 20 years of being out of high school, that's basically what I got out of it, is that we stayed neutral in war for a very long time, dropped a bomb on Japan, and this was like the Bretton Woods monetary system was America's demands. So I could totally understand why they would come to us with their demands like, nah, we can't do this, because it truly benefited you more than it did us when we were the reason why we were all doing this fighting. So that's really what I got out of what the guy told me on Wall Street.
Good. I think, did you have a question or no? Go from the microphone. And then Alvin will be the last because we have to wrap up.
Yeah, I have worked for a bank for 25 years, National Westminster Bank, which is an English bank. And I was taught very strictly that when you have a loan, you can not pay interest on interest. When you get the interest on your loan and you have to pay because you are loaning the money, you are not allowed to get interest on the loan, the interest you have paid, but only on the original capital. So that was a more clean banking, and that was just about money, deposits and loans, early in the banking world. Later on, they came in with some other bankings, not just about money, but about real estate. Isn't that two separate things? Why do you call it real estate banking? To me, it's two separate things. So little by little, it became so confused, the real estate banking. More and more, for example, Chase Bank, they have a lot of real estate banking, and they really steal your money.
because it's not only interest on interest, but it's also fees on interest. So when you have money in the bank, little by little, the bank is just stealing all your money.
Right. I guess that's the short version. But, I mean, it's looting the whole economy, and I think Bill alluded to this earlier. Now I lost my train of thought about that. But that is the whole craziness they've done. I mean, you have banks that now own energy companies. I mean, it's just, they have nothing to do with banking. Or you could separate and you sell these things like the mortgage-backed securities, or you sell the principal on a loan to one company, you sell the interest payments to someone else. And it all has to do with money and has nothing to do with Lyndon LaRouche's science of physical economy, which is not measured in terms of money. And I think what you're getting at is a really good example of why you never want to measure economy in terms of money. You measure it in physical parameters of what happens to the human beings in your economy. Do they live longer? Are they healthier? Are they better educated? And can you sustain more people in a given area of land with a higher standard of living, which is the actual metric, not money? But Alvin, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so the Glass-Steagall subject and conversation is good. But I think for new people watching or tuning in, and for those that have been around, it was Lyndon LaRouche and this organization that made Glass-Steagall a household name. It's not something Elizabeth Warren or anyone else brought up. It was the constant barrage of congressmen and senators and visits in the office that brought Glass-Steagall to the forefront. But Lynn was never satisfied with that, and people know that through the 4 laws, and he was pretty hard on us, insisting that we really didn't understand Glass-Steagall at all for quite some time, because we were simply looking at it as a law and not a principle. And he said, if you want to understand it, you have to refer to the General Welfare Clause in our Constitution, because that's the principle that FDR was using. And so when the subject comes up, because people do remember 2008 very well, unless they're very young. And the stench of a collapse is in the air. So people that I'm talking with, while I have not been out in the field, my conversations and activity with contacts of mine has increased. And who's bringing up Glass-Steagall now? They are. It's coming from their voices. And then you have to go into the 4 laws in order for them to avoid the panic that they're speaking to you from. Because they're saying, oh my God, right? Everything, where's going to happen to me? As if this system can be saved at all, and they try and worm their way around it. It's easily correctable, but only if you take them step by step through Hamilton, through actual history, and then, of course, take them to the moon. And they say, oh, and that there is something called, it doesn't have to be chaos. It can be an organized bankruptcy, a bankruptcy reorganization, and things don't have to collapse. So, and the other thing was, one of FDR's famous quotes, and what they're having is fear. That's what's gripping them, the fear itself. And as it's noted that a woman approaches FDR in his car one day and mentions a particular law that she thinks he should pass, and his response to her was, that's a good idea, and I'll be happy to do that if you make me. And we're in a position now where we can make them, even people that we don't like, that we don't agree with on very many things. They don't want to see this thing go down. They sense it, unlike 2008, when Lynn warned a year in advance and no one wanted to pay attention. Now we have their ear, we have that opportunity, but we have to use Lynn's 4 laws and Lynn's name in order for that to resonate in their minds clearly.
Good. So I think we're going to conclude. Bill, do you have anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, let me just mention a couple of things. One is that, the attempt by Pence and others to create this new world order is really doomed to failure. Whatever whatever way one looks at it, we are now effectively moving towards a multipolar world. China is a very proud nation. They've made tremendous advances technologically. They're not going to succumb to some dictate from the United States. They want to work with the United States, probably more than any other country in the world because of the importance of the U.S. And that offer is open. It's up to the United States to take it. Russia is also another case. They're not going to buckle under. They're a proud nation. And the only option at moving forward now is no longer an option of going back to where the United States was calling the shots. There's only an issue of having partnerships with other nations. And if you try and move in the direction of instituting this unilateral dictatorship, it will lead to military conflict because these countries are not going to back down. And even countries like India that are being played on, also very proud, and they're not going to become a patsy in this war. So the only course for the United States is to learn to accept the fact that we now have a world in which partnerships are going to be the most important thing, not determined by the United States, but determined by the common interest of those countries who join in that partnership. The other thing I mentioned to you is I have a present which was sent to the EIR office here, and it came into my mailbox, I guess, because I could read it, which is the Russian version of Ambassador Antonov's greetings to the conference. I don't know if you received a copy of this, but it's on a very embossed paper with the official seal of the Russian embassy. And I'll send that up to you if you don't have it, and something you should put on the wall in the office there.
To which conference? Morristown?
It was to the Galaxy, the space conference. Remember, Ambassador Antonov, the ambassador to
Yes.
the United States,
Great,
sent that.
great,
So-
wonderful. You have anything? Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, the only thing I'd like to say at the end here is please come out with us. Not please, come out with us. We need to make these things happen. So play a role in making it happen, and then you'll have a better insight into what's necessary to make it happen. Because you'll find out what it's like talking to people that you've never met before about these concepts. And you'll come to realize some of the problems that have to be overcome, what's effective, what's not effective. You'll come up with some new ideas yourself. That, and the other thing I wanted to say is that every week in EIR, there is a wonderful paper written by Lyndon LaRouche, and they're worth reading. So you can even do it with friends. You can subscribe to EIR, and then you'll be sure to get one every week.
Good. So thank you, Bill and Jason. I think this actually has been a very interesting discussion. It went in a direction I didn't expect, and that's fun. And we have a lot of work to do, emphatically beginning with Lyndon LaRouche being exonerated as quickly as possible so that his ideas can be known in every household in the United States. So thank you, and we'll see everyone next week.